Welcome back to Klepper's Corner. Today in history. May 20th is one of those dates where humanity keeps trying to organize itself, usually by holding a council, storming a castle, crossing an ocean, or inventing pants sturdy enough to survive capitalism. Segment 1, an orthodoxy with an imperial seating chart. In 325, Emperor Constantine called the First Council of Nicaea because Christianity, the faith he had embraced politically before fully joining sacramentally, was already doing what institutions do best, forming committees and accusing the other committee of destroying civilization. The dispute centered on Arius, who argued that Christ was created and subordinate to God the Father, which sounds abstract until you remember an empire nearly fractured over one Greek word. Constantine brought hundreds of bishops to Nicaea and backed homoousios, meaning Christ was of one substance with the Father, because nothing says spiritual humility like an emperor helping define metaphysics while Roman authority waits outside with a clipboard. The council condemned Arianism, produced the Nicene Creed, shaped canon law, and set a precedent that would echo for centuries. Theology may be about heaven, but enforcement keeps an office on earth. There's also the famous legend that St. Nicholas of Myra slapped Arius, which historians doubt, but culture refuses to surrender because Santa Claus throwing hands over Christology is too perfect to bury. The darker joke is that Constantine helped nail down Christian orthodoxy before he himself was baptized, like a man redesigning the whole restaurant menu while still waiting for a table. Nicaea did not just settle doctrine. It welded belief, power, and bureaucracy together, and Europe spent centuries learning that holy arguments feel different when the empire owns the gavel. Segment 2, and Magna Carta with a helmet reminder. In 1217, England was trying to keep monarchy from becoming a medieval yard sale. King John had been so unpopular that after signing Magna Carta, he got the Pope to cancel it, which is the 13th century version of accepting terms and conditions and then calling customer support to say you were under duress. The barons invited Prince Louis of France to take the throne because apparently when your king is terrible, the solution is to import a different royal problem with a better accent. Then John died, leaving the crown to 9-year-old Henry III, and the job of saving the kingdom fell to William Marshall, already in his 70s and still somehow the most reliable adult in the room. On May 20th, Marshall marched to relieve Lincoln Castle, held by Lady Nicola de la Haye, a widowed castellan in her 60s who had already survived a siege and was doing the work legends usually assign to a teenager with a sword and a prophecy. The battle had everything. A bishop sneaking through a hidden gate, defenders spotting weaknesses from a tower, and Marshall charging so eagerly that his own men had to remind him to put on his helmet. That is not just bravery. That is Grandpa leaving for war with the same energy most people leave for the grocery store without their wallet. The Royalists won. Prince Louis's campaign collapsed, and Marshall's government reissued Magna Carta to stabilize the realm. Then, the victors looted Lincoln so badly, the battle earned the nickname the Lincoln Fair, because medieval public relations meant naming a riot after a festival and hoping nobody checked the receipts. Segment 3, and spices maps and the most traveled corpse in Europe. May 20th also belongs to the Age of Oceans, when European monarchs looked at Arab and Venetian control over spice routes and thought, what if we bypass the middleman by inventing global capitalism with cannons attached? In 1498, Vasco da Gama reached Calicut after rounding Africa and crossing the Indian Ocean, proving a direct sea route from Europe to India was possible. It was a stunning navigational achievement, but the first impression was less glorious than the maps suggest. Da Gama arrived at one of the richest trading cities in the world and presented the Zamorin with cloth, hats, coral, sugar, oil, and honey, which landed with the prestige of bringing gas station souvenirs to a royal wedding. Local merchants recognized the Portuguese as an armed threat and whispered that Da Gama looked less like an ambassador and more like a broke pirate with branding issues. Relations collapsed. Da Gama kidnapped locals before leaving, and the sea route revealed its business model quickly. trade backed by violence dressed as destiny. 8 years later, Christopher Columbus died in Valladolid, still insisting he had reached Asia, which is a level of workplace denial that would now require HR and a corrected map. His remains became an imperial itinerary. Valladolid, Seville, Santo Domingo, Havana, back to Seville, and maybe still partly in the Dominican Republic. Spain moved his bones whenever empire lost territory, like a landlord carrying the security deposit from one collapsing property to the next. In life, he could not correctly identify where he was. In death, nations are still arguing about where he is. Segment 4, and free land blue jeans and airplanes with no windshield. By the 19th and early 20th centuries, May 20th shifts from empires crossing oceans to nations selling expansion as opportunity and outsourcing the consequences to everyone beneath the brochure. In 1862, with Southern lawmakers gone from Congress because they had seceded to defend slavery, President Abraham Lincoln signed the Homestead Act, opening Western federal land to settlers who would live on it, farm it, and pay a small fee. It gave poor families, immigrants, women, and freed people a chance at property, eventually distributing around 270 million acres, while treating indigenous homelands as empty inventory, as if the continent were a warehouse with extra shelves in the back. In 1873, Jacob Davis and Levi Strauss received a patent for copper-riveted work pants, creating what we now call blue jeans. The ultimate symbol of casual rebellion began as reinforced industrial clothing for workers whose pockets kept ripping while they mined, built, and hauled the country into shape. A Russian Jewish tailor and a Bavarian dry goods merchant somehow invented the uniform of cowboys, rock stars, teenagers, and dads at Home Depot. Then aviation added altitude. In 1927, Charles Lindbergh crossed the Atlantic in the Spirit of St. Louis, stripped so brutally for weight that it had no radio, no parachute, no forward windshield, and a fuel tank in front of the cockpit. 5 years later, Amelia Earhart made her own solo Atlantic crossing, battling ice and mechanical failure before landing in a Northern Ireland cow pasture. When asked if she had flown far, she said, "From America," the calmest possible answer after turning a damaged airplane into feminist punctuation. May 20th keeps selling risk as progress, and somehow the invoice always arrives later. Segment 5, and the 20th century discovers resistance is not a footnote. The 20th century events of May 20th are where the date gets darker, because modern states developed a terrifying talent for organizing cruelty while ordinary people kept finding ways to resist anyway. In 1940, Auschwitz received its first official prisoners, 30 German criminals transferred from Sachsenhausen to serve as capos. That detail shows the camp's logic from day one. Build a hierarchy of terror before the machinery of mass murder reached full scale. Auschwitz became the deadliest camp of the Holocaust, where more than 1.1 million people, most of them Jews, were murdered. A year later, Germany launched the airborne invasion of Crete, filling the sky with paratroopers and gliders in the first major invasion of its kind. Germany captured the island, but the cost was so shocking that Hitler never again approved a large-scale airborne assault, a victory that looked at the bill and canceled the subscription. Cretan civilians fought back with old rifles, knives, pitchforks, and whatever history had left lying around the house, proving occupation is always harder when the locals refuse to read the script. In 1983, the Church Street bombing in Pretoria showed how apartheid had pushed South Africa into a violent struggle, where military targets and civilian lives could be shattered on the same street. And in 2002, East Timor became independent after Portuguese rule, brutal Indonesian occupation, and a UN-backed transition. Nearly a quarter of the population had died, yet at midnight, the new flag rose anyway. That does not make suffering noble. It makes survival astonishing. May 20th reminds us that power loves uniforms and official language, but people under that power keep doing the one thing systems hate most: refusing to disappear. In conclusion, May 20th gives us councils, castles, sea routes, land grants, genes, airplanes, camps, invasions, bombings, and independent ceremonies. The pattern is not that humanity progresses in a straight line. It is that we keep building machines of power, then acting shocked when people trapped inside them start rattling the bolts.